for like first 10 and 15 minutes of the talk last week. Just for the sake of authenticity, I kind of thought to give visual representation of maybe like how my first 10 minutes probably sounded like, especially to people who did not attend. So basically what we tried to cover last time is that on a slightly more serious note is we tried to discuss a range of limitations of the current diagnostic systems of mental health disorders. And there are many, but just to kind of quickly go through them, the main ones are comorbidity. So typically, it's very rare that one patient who meets criteria for one disorder does not meet criteria for at least one, and usually several more additional disorders. Also, what neuroimaging and more recently genetic research, large-scale research has shown is that there is a range of shared neurobiological factors across virtually all disorders. So very few specific factors when you, for example, compare ASD and schizophrenia and ADHD. The important one is also within category heterogeneity. So there is a varying manifestation and severity of core symptom profiles regardless of the disorder, both in terms of core symptoms, but also co-occurring symptoms in terms of different timing of the symptom onset, but also trajectory, and also widely different response to interventions. And finally, a lot of research has shown that psychopathology is a continuing phenomena in nature. Last time we, as a good example of all these issues with diagnostic criteria, are neurodevelopmental disorders, in particular, autism spectrum disorder. Last time, I focused on restricted and repetitive behaviors and tried to demonstrate how, on one hand, diagnostic-centric research has limited our ability to understand mechanisms behind one of the major symptom domains, and that is restricted and repetitive behaviors, or RRB. And on the other hand, how integrating findings from across normative and atypical population can help us understand this symptom domain hopefully better. So I, just very quickly to recap, I covered some of our previous work demonstrating the key role of anxiety and also impaired self-regulation as key mechanisms behind one aspect of repetitive behaviors, and that is insistence on sameness, and also how that domain can have a range of negative long-term impact on the functioning of the individual. I also summarized our previous work that aimed to utilize a range of existing big data sets to clarify the factor structure of repetitive behaviors across a range of existing scales and interviews. In terms of the future directions, and as a next step of this work, I talked a little bit about planned treatment. So there's a pilot study. Will hopefully, now it's been delayed because of the COVID situation, but hopefully we'll be starting next March. That would target anxiety in young kids with autism, and then look at the effects on insistence on sameness. So because anxiety is risk factor, but also maintenance factor on insistence on sameness, we're going to look at whether by reducing anxiety, we will be able to reduce insistence on sameness. And also in the study that's in the existing data project that funded by Autism Speaks, that will hopefully start soon, as soon as we set up the data user agreement, we aim to utilize a big data approach to investigate genetic architecture of the identified repetitive behaviors domain through both GWAS studies, but also analyzing de novo protein coding mutations. And then also as a next step, to explore the links between these behaviors and also structural and functional atypicalities in targeted corticostriatal circuits. Associative motor and also the limbic neural circuits that our previous work has shown might be involved in repetitive behaviors. And finally, as I mentioned last time, RRB are very heterogeneous set of behaviors, and also set of behaviors that tends to extend across a range of disorders. However, although a lot of currently available measures are quite useful, they're also limited in a lot of ways, in particular in terms of their comprehensiveness. So they don't tend to allow us to sample repetitive behaviors that occur across a range of disorders. Therefore, in a recently funded project, we are aiming to develop a comprehensive assessment of repetitive behaviors. I think the main issue will be coming up with a good name. The one that we now have abbreviates as CARB, which is probably not the most fortunate abbreviation, but hopefully we'll work a little bit on that. So now transitioning from repetitive behaviors to another domain that's classically thought as being specific to autism. And those are social processing impairments. So impaired social functioning is an early emerging and also stable hallmark diagnostic feature of autism, but it's not specific to autism, but it actually occurs across a wide array of neurodevelopmental and neuropsychiatric disorders. Regardless of what the primary categorical diagnosis might be, these impairments tend to be stable, so they persist across time, and they're associated with a wide range of negative outcomes. And these include outcomes for the individual, so poor quality of life, poor mental health, suboptimal education and employment outcomes, but they also have a broader range of implications and also impact, including strain on families and also significant public health costs, both direct through the necessity to support individuals, but also indirect through reducing their ability to work and function independently. And where the limitations of the current diagnostic systems really come true is that individuals who are classified, or people who are classified under separate diagnostic categories can exhibit a range of shared social functioning deficits, while those diagnosed with the same disorder can exhibit different deficits. So for example, people with autism vary widely in terms of their social profiles. So although we prototypically tend to think about people with autism as having low social motivation or a low desire to interact socially, that's really not the case. And there is a proportion of people with autism who actually have a very strong desire to interact socially. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. So it really remains very difficult, just based on the diagnosis, to predict long-term outcomes and choose adequate interventions. And this is primarily due to the lack of accurate characterization of the mechanisms that underlie social functioning impairments. Fortunately, I guess we'll see what next 10 years bring. But at least at this point, the NIMH research domain criteria framework is potentially a useful dimensional framework for explaining a range of deficits across disorders. So this framework argues that variation in clinical phenomenology results from a disruption in functioning of discrete fundamental neural systems that govern domains that you can see on this scheme. And those are positive and negative valence, cognitive ability, social processes, and arousal. So RDOC envisions a set of psychological constructs, which you can see in this smaller print here, that are organized into larger associated domains, such as, for example, negative valence. And these individual constructs are thought to function along a continuum from normal to abnormal. And the balance of construct functionality contributes to the overall mental, I would say, constitution of every individual. So RDOC defines a set of basic biologically driven distinct processes that underpin social functioning that, if it disrupted, can impede one's ability to navigate social complexities of the social world. These constructs include affiliation and attachment, social communication, which comprises reception and production of facial and non-facial communication, perception and understanding of the self, and perception and understanding of the others. And these domains can be used to identify sources of variation in social impairments across affected individuals, regardless of their diagnostic status, which is really a step that's necessary for us to develop etiologically based individualized treatments. So just an example. This is partly to illustrate how these domains are useful, also partly because I wanted to play a short clip from Curb Your Enthusiasm. I'll play a short video, and then we'll kind of discuss how some of these basic constructs can actually be useful.
Over? Marriage?
Why would our marriage be over?
So, we need to talk.
Yeah, we need to talk about Marty Funkhauser's party.
Oh, okay. I thought, forget it.
I don't know what you think.
Well, you know, you said we need to talk. Generally, when couples break up, they talk.
Well, why would you even think that?
Well, because women have broken up with me many times, and they've always introduced we need to talk. So I'm just so conditioned to that response.
And when women break up with you, light up like that?
Yeah, so it doesn't really improve from there. But as you can see that the outcome of the social interaction is quite negative, but there is a range of different processes that could contribute to it. So misreading of the basic social expressions, or so, for example, the facial expressions, issues in understanding the mental states, also the issues how things have been communicated, both in terms of just the verbal content, but also in terms of the prosody. And when we think about why the social interaction breaks down for certain individuals, we have to really consider what are the underpinning factors. And there is many ways to arrive at the same outcome, I guess. So unfortunately, although the RDOC framework is useful potentially to understand the social impairments across disorders, the translation of this framework into research and clinical practice has really been impeded by the lack of dedicated dimensional measures. There's been a lot of, over the last decade, or especially the last 5 years, there's been a lot of investment, especially in US, both by National Institute of Mental Health, but also more specific funding bodies such as Salmon's Foundation, which focuses on autism and neurodevelopmental disorders, towards establishing large databases that contain a number of measures for very large samples. And these measures vary from genetics to neuroimaging to questionnaire measures. And majority of these questionnaires measures have not been specifically, well, actually none of them have been specifically designed to capture the RDOC social processes. So although they haven't been designed for that purpose, by going through the measures, it's clear that they do have some potential to be at least somewhat useful. So in the RO3 funding that we worked on prior, what we proposed is that it's really important to see whether we can establish effective means of capturing and extracting relevant RDOC domains from already collected data, even if it's in a manner that's somewhat coarse and suboptimal. because this can really offer an important bridge towards providing initial testing of the explanatory framework or explanatory power of this framework, but it can also present research and clinical communities with alternative means of assessing key dimensional constructs until measures that are specifically designed to capture components of functioning across clinical at risk and normative populations are developed. So the aims of the RO3 project was to identify existing measures that are able to capture some of the proposed RDOC social constructs and sub-constructs, to conduct stringent psychometric evaluation to test whether this is really the case, and also explore the potential utility of the map domains in capturing clinically meaningful subgroups in existing large data sets. So I'll just provide two very brief examples. So one is our recent paper published in JCAP, where we focus on the social responsiveness scale. So it's a very widely used measure for capturing different aspects of autism phenotype, but it's quite heavy on the social impairments, and it's been shown that it has some dimensionality, so it's potentially useful. So we merged the data from six distinct databases, which resulted in a sample of around 27,000 individuals. And they ranged from normative samples, so kids and adolescents who were typically developing, and that was around 30% of the sample. And it also included the clinical subsample, which was a majority, so around 70%. Out of those 70%, 80% had autism and 20% have other neurodevelopmental and neuropsychiatric disorders. So the first question that we asked is whether this measure, SRS, is really useful for capturing some of the RDOC social processing constructs. So we utilized the exploratory structural equation modeling approach, and we tested the range of conceptual factor structure models. So unidimensional, a 3-factor model with attachment affiliation, social communication, and understanding of mental states factors. And then a 4-factor model where social communication was further split into production and of facial and non-facial communication. So on the right-hand side, you can see the kind of the overall factor structure. And on the left-hand side, just very briefly, and this is just abbreviated table, but just some key statistics suggesting that both 3- and 4-factor models show a pretty good fit, with the 4-factor model, which is more fine-grained, showing a more superior fit across a range of indices. So there seems to be some potential for this measure to be useful, but there is also a lot of limitations, and I'll touch on them a little bit later. But they include really insufficient coverage across all these domains. So that it might be somewhat useful as a kind of first approximation, and might be useful for us to be able to mine some of these large data sets by utilizing these latent variables. It's also limited in a lot of ways. So we then asked, can these social constructs be used to provide a meaningful characterization of individual clinical cases? So we used the subsample of those 27,000 kids, the clinical subsample. So both kids who had autism, but also kids who had other neurodevelopmental disorders. And we utilized the latent profile analysis to see whether we can identify potentially distinct subgroups. There is some indications that we can. So as you can see, for example, mental state understanding is in the opposite direction between these two profiles, and so is facial communication production. And there's a range of the other differences. So we've currently submitted sort of like a follow-up NIH grant that aims to utilize not only the SRS-based social domains, but also domains across a range of other measures to, first of all, characterize the subgroups, then to explore their longitudinal predictive validity. So there is a subsample that we have access to of around 4,000 kids that have been tracked over the period of 4 years. So we'll see whether their baseline subgroup assignment is actually useful in understanding how well those kids do over time. So that's sort of like a second aim. And then the third aim, we're going to try to identify and understand whether these phenotypically based, at least behaviorally and questionnaire based profiles can actually then be mapped onto the underpinning genetic and neurobiological individual differences. So both focusing on genetic and neuroimaging data. Second really interesting question is categorical versus dimensional conceptualization of the psychopathology. So one of the most fundamental distinctions between current diagnostic nosologies such as DSM and ICD and the RDOC framework is really pertains to the categorical versus dimensional conceptualization of psychopathology. So unlike current systems that are based on a categorical view, which assumes qualitative differences between someone who has a disorder and someone who doesn't, RDOC is a fully dimensional framework based on the premise that psychopathology is a matter of degree rather than a kind. And this is not just an academic and kind of statistical debate, but it actually really influences research and clinical practice in fundamental ways through guiding assessment, research design, analysis, and views of etiology. So just an example, so if psychopathology is truly categorical, we really need to optimize our instruments to not for grading the severity, but just to yes and no, does the individual has a disorder or doesn't. So to address this question on whether RDOC social processes are best represented by dimensional, categorical, or hybrid model, actually, sorry, just as a first note, so there is a substantial body of evidence providing support for the dimensional nature of a wide range of psychopathologies. In particular, two really great reviews by Nick Haslam in 2012 and also one that just came out, I think, this year. However, none of the work thus far has specifically just focused on a social functioning and whether that is best represented in a dimensional or categorical way. So to address this question, there is various different statistical approaches, but the one that we utilized is to compare the fit of psychometric counterpounds of the dimensional, categorical, and hybrid models. So that's a factor analysis, latent class analysis, and factor mixture modeling to existing data set by employing the framework described by Clark et al. What that means is that you basically conduct a factor analysis, you identify the most optimal model, you conduct a latent profile analysis, identify the most optimal model, and the same with factor mixture modeling. And then you compare the one that provides the best fits to the data. So we've done that with SRS. And indeed found that it's a dimensional or factor analysis model which is superior in terms of the fits to the data. And also we've done with another questionnaire measure in a paper that we published recently, JCPP. So the measure is called Social Communication Questionnaire. So we've shown it's sort of efficient or effective in capturing attachment affiliation and two aspects of social communication. And just very briefly, I mean, this is just a brief capture, but if you look at the BIC, you can see that it's the lowest for a factor analysis, followed by the factor mixture modeling, which allows variation in the continuous latent variables within the identified classes. So it's a hybrid model, and then the latent class analysis shows the worst fits to the data. Obviously, these are the parent reports. So they're by definition biased by a specific view of a person who reports on it. But we are currently, and it's very preliminary, so I'm not able to show any detail, but we've collected eye tracking data across 5 different social attention tasks in both United States, but also in Qatar. So we are exploring the structure of the social attention, whether there is any cultural differences, but also we started looking at both using the taxometric framework, but also the one that I just described, whether social attention is dimensional, hybrid, or categorical. And these samples are fairly considerable if we consider it's eye tracking, so it's around 400 in each country, and they encompass typically developing kids, kids with a range of neurodevelopmental disorders, and also kids with autism. So I covered a little bit about RDOC and existing measures and the work that we've done to really see whether we can utilize what's already out there, especially in the big data sets in order to approximate some of the RDOC domains. But what is clear is that current measures are really suboptimal, both in terms of their item content, but also the fact that although some of them have relative dimensionality, they're still more optimized for sensitivity and specificity rather than having a broad range. So the key next step really into being able to adopt dimensional framework and also trying to really understand how individual variation across a range of key social constructs can contribute to the differences in the social functioning impairments is to design a new measure, which is able to A, be comprehensive, and B, being quantitative. So when I was a postdoc at Stanford, we started doing a work on the scale that has been designed years ago by Antonio Harden, who was a Stanford PI. The measure was designed before the actual RDOC, but it's quite a detailed measure, and it's also designed with a dimensional framework in mind. And it was designed to capture different aspects of social motivation and attachment, to capture social communication in great detail, and also to capture in kids' ability to read and understand social signals. So what we've done is that these are very preliminary pilot data that have been published, is that we collected data, first of all, from 175 kids and adolescents with autism who completed the SSDS or Stanford Social Dimension Scale. So then we utilized, as always, the latent variable modeling approach, so ESM, to evaluate the factor structures. So we've shown that it has quite a good coverage of a social motivation, social affiliation or social attachment, different aspects of social communication, but also what we call social recognition, but it's really ability to read basic social signals and also understand them. So the level of more like a theory of mind. So we also explored convergent and divergent validity with a range of other measures such as SRS. We also looked at whether some of these different domains are differently associated with IQ and internalizing and externalizing problems. So obviously this was done just with kids who have autism. So we also wanted to see whether there's invariance and also dimensionality for this scale when used with a more heterogeneous sample. So we collected, again, not that big sample of 624 kids who were typically developing, around 50% of the sample, but the ones who had a range of neurodevelopmental and neuropsychiatric disorders, again, around 50% of the sample. And we shown that we were able to replicate the factor structure and shown that majority of the items were actually invariant, and the scale had a pretty good internal consistency. So the second step was to see whether some of these factors were useful in capturing individual variability in the social profiles of kids with autism. So we used the latent profile analysis to see whether we can identify existence of homogeneous subgroups of kids with autism. So you can see on the figure on top, it's a bit small, so I'm not sure. I apologize if it's not clear. But we identified 4 profiles or 4 clusters as the optimal solution. The groups were not only distinguished in terms of the severity gradient, but also in terms of distinctive patterns of strengths and weaknesses across different social domains. So there were groups that were characterized with higher social motivation, in groups with lower social motivation, but also groups who while performing pretty good relative to obviously having a disorder, they had particular impairments in just one particular domain, such as, for example, mental state understanding. And also these groups were predictive of outcomes. For example, kids who had high social motivation, but poor understanding of mental states were the highest risk of anxiety and depression. So it's quite useful in some ways, at least at this point. So the plan is we've applied for the R01 funding to further develop this scale. So to develop additional items that cover additional domains, but also to develop the mobile app through the experience sample methodology. So Pete Koval is the CI on the project. We got pretty good reviews, so we're going to resubmit the grants very soon. Well, not very soon, in November when the deadline is, but it's pretty promising. So we're hoping to develop this work much further. So these 2 papers that I presented are just very preliminary, and we kind of use them as a pile of data for the grant. And I'm almost kind of mindful of the time and to leave some time for the discussion. But I just also wanted to just briefly mention, in case it's of interest to other people, that in addition to this work on repetitive behaviors that I covered last time and sort of very quickly recapped this time, and also the work on a kind of social phenotype, the other area that I'm really interested in, and we've been doing a lot of work, is in terms of the neurodevelopmental disorders and mental health. So we know that irrespective of the age, at least 40% of kids with autism show clinically very severe levels of anxiety and depression. And at least around 20 to 30% of additional kids also show reasonable levels of anxiety and depression to the point where it impacts their functioning. So we've done quite a bit of work in terms of how best to assess anxiety and depression in this population, and just in terms of the sheer frequency. We also looked at how that impacts functioning, and especially in kids with autism who have IQ in the normative range, so IQ above 70. It's actually these mental health problems that are the most negative predictors of the long-term outcomes. And we started to look at what are the predictors, what are the risk factors. So we're focusing on emotional regulation. We are looking at intolerance of uncertainty, in addition to emotional awareness and alexithymia. And the second aspect that we are I'm working on with colleagues, in particular Darren Hadley from La Trobe, on a national Australian study with kids, adolescents. Well, it's actually really a lifespan study, is the on suicidality. So mortality rate for premature death by suicide in people with autism is around 10 times higher than in non-autism samples. And we really have to, it's a really burning question to understand why this is the case. So we started doing a lot of work focusing on social support and loneliness. So we've shown that kids who have, I mentioned before social motivation, but kids with autism and individuals with autism who have high social motivation, usually because of their social impairments, they find it more difficult to find social support, which then leads to them having high levels of depression, and that is the predictor of the suicidal ideation. So we're currently in collaboration with Darren, trying to understand some of these paths a little bit more, and to be able to then support these people more. So thank you for the attention, and I think we have around 20 minutes for discussion, so it'd be great to see what you think, and if any, hopefully some aspects of this were at least somewhat useful. Thank you.
Awesome. So thanks, Mirko. Yep, we'll do the clap. Awesome. That's what I was just about to ask you to do. So let me open it up and ask if there are any questions. So what I thought I might do is just talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing, Mirko, just to give people kind of seed some ideas, I guess, about what I'm kind of hoping might be the prospects for interaction here. So, you would have seen that in the RDOC, one of the domains is the cognitive domain, and there was a review done of what kinds of tasks might be appropriate for assessing that particular domain. And so there are various different tasks. So there's actually, I can't remember which ones were actually in there and which ones we've been talking about, but things like the go, no go task switching kinds of tasks and so forth are the kinds of things that are incorporated into that. And then some of the other tasks that are in the reward domains, in the positive and the valence domains, the positive and negative valence domains are also tasks that would be familiar to people in the hub. So to get started, what we've been doing is looking at go no go data. So this is actually data with kids who have the 22q condition. And the just looking there, so we've I don't know if it's I'm not for sure certain that it's the first time, but I suspect it might be the first time that that people have actually applied reaction time models to try to understand this condition. And so so the data is go no go data, and so one of the dimensions on which it's possible that people varied is their ability to inhibit behaviour, and so the go no go task is seen as a direct measure of the degree in which kids or others can inhibit their behaviour. But of course, you know, we know from reaction time modelling that sometimes what on the surface looks like inhibition can actually be a consequence of things like faster stop processes or decreased drift rates in the go process and so forth. So so it's not nearly as straightforward to interpret the raw data as I think a lot of people in this literature would assume. And so we've started, we've been working on a LBA version of the go no go task. We're also just starting working with a drift model, and trying to see if we can pull apart this behaviour and see to what extent it's a consequence of different different parts of the process that as we might understand them from a cognitive modelling perspective. And I guess, you know, that's kind of one example. But what I'm hoping is that as time goes by, there'll be more opportunities for people to interact and to really cast the kind of critical eye that can come from the kind of perspectives that we bring onto the way that these, particularly the cognitive domain, but including some of the positive and negative valence domains, how they are assessed, because you know, as you would have gathered from what Mirko said, you know, across the board with the RDOC and a lot of things at the moment, it tends to be, you know, more either parent report or more you know, some clinical observation, but not perhaps as rigorous kind of assessment as we might wish to see. So I guess, yeah, that's just by way of saying this is where I think the connection can be, even though at first glance here, this might seem to be quite a long way away from where we typically operate.
So Mirko, I had a question. Can I ask you about the kind of path diagram you had towards the end? It looked like the diagram for a structural equation model.
Yes. You're on mute, Mirko.
I was muted, yes, of course.
So, yeah, I don't see it on my screen, but I guess I don't need it to ask a question. I was wondering about how you think about causality in these kinds of situations and what approach there is to causal identification.
Yeah. So the data that we had is just a 12-month follow-up data. And these are adolescents and adults, so it's difficult to imply any causation based on what we've done. But some of the previous work that has looked at kids as well, what tends to be shown is that over time, at least with the specific model I was referring to, is that it's a combination of individual differences, how likely someone who has social impairment, so people who are not able to effectively communicate, not able to effectively manage their social circle in terms of finding social support, but also maintaining it, but at the same time are also very motivated to find social circles. So those people over time tend to develop depression. And then that depression tends to be predictive of their suicidal ideation. So this is not suicidal attempts. These are just people reporting that they're thinking a range of specific thoughts that we tend to term as a suicidal ideation. So it's a very exploratory model. So we are not able to imply any causation, but if we think about findings from other populations, which are not autism, but just the general population, these factors tend to actually be quite predictive of, first of all, ideation, but also then a number of suicidal attempts, and unfortunately, retrying the suicidal attempts once they're unsuccessful. So the lack of social support, not being able to have social support, is actually something that's making a person who attempted the suicide once at a much higher risk to do it again. So we're kind of we try to bring these, I guess, findings from across different disorders and kind of implement them within autism field. And just as a kind of quick follow-up, so the sample where I show on the path diagram, currently there's an Australian grant to actually follow it up further. So to do at this point, it will be a 5-year follow-up, and to do more detailed and more in-depth clinical interviews with this part of the sample that actually reported suicidal ideation, to go into more detail about it. So that's so like just more description of the framework, I guess, or the context of the findings.
So in general, in this literature, are there people who try to run causal analyses based on observational data, or is it more people would do a correlational kind of study and then use that as a basis for a randomized trial or an intervention and establish the causal claims that way?
Yeah, so as Simon also mentioned, the field is kind of very run with a questionnaire and interview data rather than for example, something like such as experience sample methodology. So it's more correlational, and then based on that you tend to do the URCM, and that tends to inform the support program. So it's not something where you're tracking people in day-to-day variation in terms of their ideation, in terms of their ability to regulate, in terms of their social, I guess, social milieu. And that's something we're kind of trying to do with this assessment that we hopefully from next year we'll start developing. So in addition to the questionnaire, which is easily administered, but it's not that useful in terms of being able to understand any causality, we actually also want to design it as a ESM sort of application so that we'll be able to implement that within some of the longitudinal studies. So yeah.
Okay, thanks.
So yeah, I might just follow up on, so I think perhaps what Charles was getting at there is there are multiple different approaches to actually trying to establish the causality, and so there are, the more traditional approach is to establish an association and then do some form of experimentation. There are also these kind of like Pearl style methods where you have some kind of observational data, you apply some underlying causal assumptions in there, and then or assumptions about the causal process, and then try to establish the likelihood of different possible causal models. And then there's these convergent cross-mapping kinds of approaches, which typically use this much more fine-grained data, like as you might get from an experience sampling procedure, to try to establish what is really the degree of dynamic coupling between variables, I guess. And yeah, I guess it does strike me that this might actually be an interesting. So there's been a I don't know if it'd be fair to say it was a debate, but at least some mild discussion in the past about the relative pros and cons of these different approaches and so forth. But I think the reality is that there's never really been much by way of a systematic comparison as far as I'm aware, and so it would actually be quite interesting, I think, to pick a domain that actually matters like this, and to see to what extent these different approaches, either converge on the same conclusions or diverge.
Yeah, no, that definitely will be very interesting for sure. And also in the psychopathology kind of literature, there's a huge, especially in the last few years, between the network analysis and the more classic latent kind of like a factor analysis. So there's like Bob Kruger on one hand, who is doing the factor analysis of the structural psychopathology, and there's also another group that is kind of looking at the supposedly causal interrelationship between different symptoms. So it's quite interesting, and they don't seem to agree on any convergence. So it's quite interesting to always look at different models and whether you can derive any kind of agreement or not, especially if you want to inform the assessment and especially the support programs.
Yeah. Okay, are there any other questions people have?
I had just a quick question, if I could. I was wondering whether you're aware of if there's similar work going on with regards to schizophrenia and who's doing that work.
In terms of, is it in terms of mental health or more social impairments, or just RDOC in general?
I guess RDOC in general.
Yeah. Yeah, so I would say that schizophrenia has a more, interestingly enough, has a more history of thinking dimensionally about the disorders, especially some of the leading groups, for example, Dutch group led by Jim van Os. So they are they started doing quite a bit of work, especially in terms of understanding social domains. So theory of mind, and also developing kind of multimodal assessments. So there is even like a few years back, there was a focus group of the leading research groups to come up with the most optimal optimal assessments across different domains of the social functioning. So there's a few papers by Green. So he was the leading author. Yeah, I'm happy to share some of this. So I would say that in terms of schizophrenia, but again, although it's dimensional, they tend to focus on schizophrenia kind of schizotypy rather than looking at across the different neuropsychiatric disorders. So that's kind of a bit of an issue, I guess. But I would say that work is well and above ahead of the work in neurodevelopmental disorders.
Thanks.
Okay, well, I think we're just about at time now. So let's thank Mirko. We'll use our reactions down here. And look forward to seeing people next week. Just a reminder, so next week we're going to be doing a bit of a review of the CogSci conference. And we're still looking for people who'd be interested in talking about their favourite talks from the CogSci conference. So if you're prepared to do that, if you can email either me or Josh, and we'll line that up. But otherwise, we shall see you next week. Bye.
Bye all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.